believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. Freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Until the killing of black men, black mothers, sons is as important as the killing of white men, white mothers, sons. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Not needing to clutch for power, not needing the light just to shine on me. I need to be just one in the number as we stand against tyranny. To me, young people come first. They come first. They have the courage where we fail. If I can just shine a light on as they carry us through the gale. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. I'm a woman who speaks in a voice, and I must be heard. At times I can be quite difficult. I'll bow to no man's word. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Come on, sing. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. We who believe in freedom, we cannot rest. We cannot rest. We who believe in freedom, we cannot rest. We cannot rest. We who believe in freedom, we cannot rest. We cannot rest. We who believe in freedom, we cannot rest. We cannot rest. We who believe in freedom, we cannot rest. We will not rest. We who believe in freedom, we cannot rest. We will not rest. We who believe in freedom, we cannot rest. We will not rest. We who believe in freedom, we cannot rest. We will not rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until come on, sing now. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it
A warm welcome to MR Conversations, Anne Braden Speaks with Ben Wilkins, Roz Pellez, Robin D.G. Kelly, and myself, Rebecca. Monthly Review Press is deeply honored to welcome Ben Wilkins as the editor of the just-released compilation of writings, Anne Braden Speaks. Together with his guests Roz and Robin, they're all people who are leaving lasting impacts through their work as we speak. And as social movement scholars and organizers, they know Anne Braden as someone who left tremendously lasting impacts into this current moment. They also know her as one of the more committed and influential radicals of her time, but that's not how she was supposed to be. Anne Braden made no secret that she had been raised to be a Southern belle, but instead of maintaining a sense of belonging with an entitled white society, instead of settling in comfortably in the midst of the undisguised daily horrors perpetrated by the lynching class, she became a revolutionary who helped to shape the self-understanding of the entire civil rights movement. Anne Braden left us in 2006, and on her deathbed, she proclaimed that she still had much to do. She was too busy to die. And I think we all agree that her work in search of collective liberation is far from done, and that we must continue it. But not everyone may realize the extent to which her work continues to impact us even now. Today, we're going to take the time to understand not only what we have learned, but what we can and perhaps must continue to learn from Braden's approach to organizing. And in order to do that, let's start with some personal reflections on Anne Braden. Roz knew Anne Braden personally, and the rest of us have been impacted by her work, whether we know it or not. So I guess let's start with Roz. Could you share some of what you would like us to know about her? Perhaps a memory or two?
So I'd be honored to. This book is amazing because it really gives us a chance to tell Anne's story. For those of us who knew her or knew about her, it's about remembering. And for those of us who've never heard about her, it's about being introduced to her. And Anne touched the lives of so many people and in so many different ways. I first met Anne at a very difficult time in my own life. It was a time when I feared for my safety and that of my family and that of my friends. I even questioned whether I would continue to be a part of a social justice movement that I'd been in since I was 13. And I was also feeling very isolated from the very community that I'd worked in for years. I met Anne in November of 1979. When she came to Greensboro, North Carolina, immediately after the Greensboro massacre, to stand with those of the Communist Workers' Party and those who were with us in struggles all over the country and especially in North Carolina, to stand with us after 5 of our members had been killed by the Ku Klux Klan and the Nazis in broad daylight, and where 10 others had been wounded, including my own husband, who was among them. And so she came when she didn't know us. She came because she heard about it. So Anne shows up. She shows up to support those who were attacked. She came to speak out against red baiting, and she came to let people know how heinous this crime was. And she was really there to give advice. We needed advice on those days. And she came and give advice on us activists who were pretty young and who did not have the experience to deal with this. So she really, through her courage and her political acumen and wisdom, really helped us through that. But more, I got to know her in a different way and built a relationship with her through my work with the Greensboro Justice Fund. And through that, we were able to fund and the work that she was doing with SOC, Southern Organizing Committee for Economic and Social Justice, and for the Kentucky Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. And it's through those conversations and visits and long write-ups about her work, I got to know her. And those of us at the fund really, we were not just funders. We were her students, and she was our teacher, and we were her comrades. And so she taught us through her own work that fundamental change did not come quickly. It was not overnight like some of us wanted, and that it took a protracted struggle that was lifelong. And so finally, I just spent years, we were in this relationship for years, listening to her stories and her analysis of the political times we were in. And these stories were often told at kitchen tables of our mutual friends. There was always coffee, and for Anne, there was always cigarettes. So I was always learning, and Anne was always teaching. And I used those lessons back then from the late 70s and 80s. And I use them today in my work with Poor People's Campaign and Repairers of the Breach. And so I think not only have I benefited personally from the work that Anne's done, I think that in many ways we all have. And so that's the Anne Braden that I know.
Thank you, Roz. Ben, since you're the editor of this volume, let's head to you.
Yeah, well, Anne Braden was a key strategist and leader in the freedom movement, especially, in the 1950s and 60s and beyond. And, there's a few things that Roz said that just really got me thinking. The first is her courage. I think she had political courage, moral courage, physical courage, and was not afraid to be unrespectable, which I think is so important in this moment. People could learn from that. I think the second thing, Ross talked about Anne Braden's acumen and her analysis. I think the orientation that she had is just so critically important for people to remember today, and the tradition that she really came out of the radical left movement of the 1930s and 40s that she really emerged from, and had an analysis around race, class, internationalism, imperialism, and this broader context of what the fight really meant. And then the third thing is her leadership and her mentorship. I mean, me traveling the South organizing, over the years, you just meet countless people who were directly impacted by Anne Braden. Roz is one of them, but there's literally hundreds of people who have very, very similar stories. And I think that, that leadership that she showed has been really underappreciated. Those who knew her and those who kind of understand appreciate it, but, has not been widely shared as I think it should have been. And then, I think the last thing for me, and this has happened to every movement leader of those times and the movement as a whole, is there's been this sanitizing process. Braden's biographer, Catherine Fossil, talks about this thing that started to happen as Anne Braden got older, where these institutions that had shunned her in earlier years, the, universities and newspapers that she had worked for, and, big institutions started giving her awards, but specifically did so in a way that really, sanitized what the fight was really about and what Braden was really about. So I'm, excited to talk more about her. And I think just the learning experience of learning about her courage, her analysis, and her mentorship is really important.
Yeah, please, Robin.
Okay, so first of all, I'm honored to be here, especially with my hero, Roz Pelleles, and also congratulations, Ben, on this book. My relationship with Anne goes back some to basically the late 80s. I'd actually written her, I tried to interview her for my book, it was in my dissertation on the Communist Party in Alabama, because her name came up in the record. She was writing these letters to the city commissioner. And she didn't really want to talk to me about that, but she did put me in touch with SOC. And of course, SOC ends up being one of the legacies of the CP in Alabama. But then I got to know her just because, like both Roz and Ben talked about, there was a whole network of people that she produced, that she shaped. And I think about, for example, Kate Fossil, when she was applying to do a PhD at Emory University to write about Anne Braden. And I was just leaving Emory at the time, and we got to know each other. And I continued to sort of support her work. And also my friends who were very close to Anne, Naomi Wallace and Carla Wallace. Naomi's a very good friend. Carla, of course, worked really closely with Anne, and they were mentored by them. Learned a lot as Anne learned from them, and that's another story. But the place where I really got to know Anne was we were on the board of trustees for the Davis Putter Fund, which is a fund basically organized by a group of leftists to support radical students who are doing organizing work. And so we would meet every year for these 2-day meetings. And Anne, which is since 1996 until she stopped coming, which I think was around 2003, 2004. I can't remember exactly when she stopped coming. But I just have to say the story. She was the most militantly anti-racist person I'd ever met. Meaning that she was uncompromising. So we would have this whole docket of students applying, and every single Black student, specifically Black students, she would raise them up and say, well, what about this student? And then, even me, I'm trying to push Black students, but I'm also like, okay, well, they've done this work, and this person's, And it's like, no, 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 you need to look at this. You need to look at the file. You need, it doesn't matter who it was. She was fighting for Black students so hard that all of us had to stop and say, wait a second, let's rethink our criteria for scholarships. She never, ever compromised on that. And the one last thing I'll just say about her is that there's a tendency to compare her, I think, to someone like Gracie Boggs, who's also a very influential person. They share generational background for the most part, relationship to the left. They both were shaped by Marxism, but never bound by it. They were original thinkers. But there's one difference, which I want to emphasize, I just leave you with this, is that, you know, at some point, Grace, you know, I knew Grace very well, kind of backed away from racism as a central feature of US society. She was like, well, you know, and she's working in Detroit. She's saying we need to rethink some of the things. We need to rethink the Black movement. And she used to get mad at people who would put a lot of emphasis on that. And never, ever, ever backed away from that argument. You know, racism was the central feature that we had to keep coming back to. And that was the feature that helped us understand class relations, gender relations. She kept coming back to it, and she did not apologize to anyone about that. And that, I think, made her really special.
I think before we kind of like dive into an informal conversation, let's meet Anne Braden. Let's meet the elder. As an elder organizer, we have a clip here of her talking to some younger activists and organizers about the notion of the beloved community. This is the clip from Southern Patriot. And so let's take a watch and listen to her, what she had to say.
It's a different country because of what happened in the 1960s. And that happened because young people, some of them not any older than some of the people here who are young, 14, 15, 16 years old, all through the South, stood up and said, we're going to change this thing. And we will risk our lives, and they did, and some of them gave their lives. They were trying to be able to sit at a lunch counter and get a cup of coffee. Well, you don't risk your life for a cup of coffee. They were trying to get the right to vote, which is terribly important. But I'm not sure you risk your life even for the right to vote. They risked their lives because they had a vision of a whole different world. They were going to remake the world, and in a sense, they projected a vision of a different kind of society where people's needs came first, where people cooperate instead of dog eat dog, trying to step on another person. They had a dream. They called it the beloved community. Not just a community where people would love each other, but a just community for everybody. They had that vision, and it was young people who made the difference. Nonviolent direct action was people themselves taken to the streets. The Black movement in the South shook the whole society. It was like the foundation stone was hit and the whole structure shook because it brought everything into question. Because so much in this country is based on race and the exploitation and oppression of African Americans. So once that's challenged, everything shakes.
So in contrast to her emphasis on the beloved community, which was rooted in what, especially you can see in her letter to MLK, which is in Anne Braden Speaks, it was rooted in what we could call her Marxist Christianity. How is her communism? Let's talk about her communism. How is her communism framed in the dominant narrative, or what was the way that Anne Braden was framed? So whoever wants to jump in here, go right ahead.
Well, I could start. I mean, I think it kind of depends on the time period that you're looking at, but beginning in 1954, we're really beginning in the late 40s with the onset of the Red Scare in the United States. She and her husband Carl, who were really a working tandem, were vehemently attacked, and then most famously, in 1954, they were put on trial for the crime of helping a Black family buy a house in a white neighborhood, and so they suffered just really serious levels of repression, like a lot of people did in those days. And the other thing that's happened is that it's kind of been forgotten or ignored. And that kind of radical underpinning of the movement that she was a part of and of her framework, I think, has really, really been forgotten. And, you know, I think the other thing to point to is you talked about her Marxist Christianity. I think her ability to fuse kind of material analysis, like a historical materialist analysis, with a really deep moral compass and a Christian framework, which was, you know, really key to her understanding and her raising in the South, I think is really something that is unique and important to understanding the role that she played in the movement and her ability to kind of bridge those gaps.
Great.
Oh, before you go, I was going to hear from Roz. I don't want to jump before you. Okay. Well, I'll say it very quickly because this is a very good question about the dominant narrative. Just two things about that. One, as Ben was suggesting about what's forgotten, I'm not sure there is a dominant narrative. I mean, there was a dominant narrative when she was being attacked, but I got a narrative from all the Black people who nurtured me politically and intellectually about Anne Braden. I knew about Anne Braden through Vincent Harding. I knew about Anne Braden through Manning Marable. I knew through Cornel West. I knew through Barbara Ransby. I knew through Michael Honey. These are the people who I came up with who basically told me who she was. And they talked about her in sort of three different ways. One, stone cold committed radical anti-racist. Two, small c communism. And I think we have to make a distinction because, you know, even though she had affiliations, what mattered was a small c communism. And that is to say that a much broader vision of what communism could be. And notice three, the third part, and she says this in the clip in the film, she's saying that the Black movement that emerged in the South actually had that vision. They had a vision of small c communism. No one had to teach them that, about what the world could possibly be. It wasn't just about integrating public institutions, but transforming our society. And that's why she kept saying the deepest anti-racist movements could actually liberate the entire nation, if not the world. And that, to me, is the small c communism that's not at all inconsistent with her kind of radical Christianity.
So Anne saw no contradiction in all those places where people tried to pigeonhole her, because she saw them all in their fullest place, in the place where they could serve the most people and be what they should be. And so, you know, there was an attempt to put her in a pigeonhole, to tag her with communism in the worst way, and to make her suffer for it. But her work did not come across that way. And people who Anne worked with loved her, could follow her and learn from her. And that's how people are. You know, the country and the powers that be can try to pigeonhole people, but when people's work suggest that they're building something bigger than what they're trying, where people try to pigeonhole them, people will learn from them, will follow them. You know, the masses, the working class is open to let's trying to figure out where is it that we can have our best lives. And Anne gave people an understanding of what that could look like, and made folks who came in her path, came in her way, able to envision that beloved community and want to fight for it. Even folks who didn't start out that way. Anne had a gift of making sure people understood kind of what could happen in this country, and tried to help us all get there. So in many instances, and instances where it didn't matter a lot, with organizing, Anne could not be pigeonholed. And her commitment and her understanding of the beloved community was so appreciated and opened the eyes of so many people.
And she understood how to build a fusion movement, which I think is really important. She understood how to fuse all these different tendencies, and people come from all these different places. You know, people bring their framework into the movement, and they come from a Christian perspective. Folks come from Marxist perspective. Some folks just want to form a union on their job and make higher wages. And how do you, out of all that material, build a movement towards a beloved community? And she did that so well.
Yeah. I mean, I understand and use that in my work. I mean, as I'm trying to build a fusion movement in the country through my work now, and believe that if you talk to people and tell them the truth, and that they aren't totally bankrupt, that people can be won, and believe that. And my guess is that Anne would agree that, you know, we're in a spot where we are now because we didn't take the time to talk to folks.
That's right.
We didn't take the time to say, you know, this is the real truth. We were too busy doing something else. But we now can take those lessons and we can use them, and we can build the kind of beloved community that Anne envisioned.
So I don't know if you want to jump in, Robin, with anything else. Nope. Okay. All right. I think we're gonna go into playing another clip actually already. I think riding off of this direction that we're going, you know, Braden said when communists were framed as the enemy, this set up capitalism to be exalted and cast as somehow untouchable. And then to criticize the capitalist system was to find oneself not only positioned outside the bounds of society, but pursued as part of a covert or clandestine fifth column, which represented an existential threat that must be eradicated at perhaps any cost. And, you know, I'm going to come out to the you know, MR community and say, I'm an autonomist, I'm an anarchist. I don't necessarily fall into the categories that people would expect at Monthly Review. But I'm well aware that the consequences of vilifying communists as the ultimate villains have been undeniably brutal, as has happened with anarchists as well. We're about to play a clip, and I want to warn you that it begins with chaos. And in this chaos, people die. And it is a brief clip of a few seconds of archival footage, followed by some contextualization. So we'll be watching this for about 3 minutes. And if people find this to be something they don't need to watch for the first few seconds, you know, just take a moment to breathe. All right?
Five young members of the Communist Workers' Party, they were shot down in cold blood. And that so mobilized a counter response. And Anne Braden was one of the key people to pull together a really large regional demonstration and protest. We were told we needed to pass as a Baptist church group. There was a lot of conversation about weaponry and the Klan, and it was a very, you know, for someone that really wasn't political that much, it was a really kind of threatening experience. And then when I got there, it was just huge. It was huge. There were many thousands of people there. And I just remember her voice, that Southern white accent. I mean, it was a very strong anti-racist message.
The men who pulled the triggers that killed 5 people here on the streets of Greensboro are dangerous men who must be brought to justice. But they are not the cause of our problem. They are the result. The real danger today comes from the people in high places, from the halls of Congress to the boardrooms of our big corporations, who are telling the white people that if their taxes are eating up their paychecks, it's not because of our bloated military budget, but because of government programs that benefit black people. Those people in high places who are telling white people that if young whites are unemployed, it's because blacks are getting all the jobs. Our problem is the people in power who are creating a scapegoat mentality. That is what is creating the climate in which the Klan can grow in this country, and that is what is creating the danger of a fascist movement in the 1980s in America.
I don't know about you guys. I'm getting chills because, you know, you can have these moments where you get extremely down and depressed hearing someone say that back then. And now we're just repeating the same conversation. Or you could say, wow, we always knew this. This was deep in our souls. Like this is something we all know to be true. And there's this, I mean, a theme that keeps coming up is conscious, you know, a conscious repression of what we all know by the people in power. There's a constant forgetting that occurs. And we just have to resuscitate that memory, even if you weren't born yet, right? Like I was born in 1977, but I didn't hear that speech, obviously, and I'm getting chills listening to it. I want to go back though, Roz, to hear about Greensboro for those who don't know, and the Greensboro massacre, what it was, and then tell us how Braden reacted and what her effect was after she showed up.
No, that tape, it depends on when I'm looking at it, but it can be jolting, especially if you were on that corner of Everett Street on that day. Greensboro was at a time similar to this. It was a time when there was an uprising. There was a rise in white supremacy. Greensboro represented one of the first times in recent history that the Klan and Nazis joined forces. They joined forces, and then they were significantly aided in carrying out these murders by the police and the BATF, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms folks. But on that day, when many of us were planning for a conference and an anti-Klan rally, we were just beginning to see this new upsurge. We were at a place that was a place for staging, not an announced place. And the Klan drove in a caravan. We believed at that time that they were just harassing the crowd, but the caravan went through to the end of the street. The last car, people got out without looking back, without dropping cigarettes from their lips, unlocked their trunks, took out guns and started to shoot people. And on that day, it was very clear that they were shooting in a crowd and shooting particular people, mostly leaders of the Communist Workers' Party at that time. So that's what happened on that. That's what happened on that day. There were no police officers there. A BATF agent had driven with them all the way to the city limits of Greensboro. And it was a time when the Communist Workers' Party and other groups like that across the country were organizing at a rate that was really unprecedented, that people were doing a different kind of organizing because that movement, it was a new communist movement, a new left movement, that people came with great skill. We had come out of various movements, civil rights, anti-war, we had come with skills. And we were talking about capitalism. And we were talking about the division, how we could not allow the division along racial lines. So that's the backdrop. So this happens, and on that day, five people are killed and 10 are wounded. and there was no police, no emergency service people on the scene. And then there occurred many years of legal battles, and really trying to lift up this struggle. But what we saw in the speech that Anne Braden gave was a speech where she recognized those who had been killed, but also took this opportunity to do a political analysis of what happened. That it wasn't just about the people with the guns on that day. It was certainly about them, but it was about the people who allowed that and encouraged that and enabled that. And she wanted everybody who could hear her voice to hear that part. So that was an amazing thing about her that day. The other thing is she had behind her two of the widows. The piece that we don't often hear about is the impact and effect of those murders, not only on us and the families and the community where it happened, but the impact had a chilling effect on a growing movement, and it divided the movement. And so Anne had them behind her for a reason, to show solidarity when often solidarity wasn't being extended, even by our own folks who were doing similar work. So people would say, based on I'm going too far here. People would say, based on Anne's history, that of course Anne would show up, right? That she would be speaking on that stage. But what people don't realize is that Anne had been in Greensboro from the moment she heard about it. She heard about it and made her way to Greensboro, and she didn't know us. She came because she didn't know us personally, but she knew us, right? And so she came to be a part of that. And then when she found that in 1 week, the mood had changed, the political understanding that was promoted by the press and the police and the folks who run this country was not that people had been murdered, but that these communists deserved it. That we had in some way called it upon ourselves. And the red baiting began, and Anne was not having it. Anne was not having it. And there was a coalition that was built that big response on February, the 1st of February. But the CWP was not allowed in the coalition that was built around the bodies of our folks who were killed by the Klan. Anne was not having it. Anne really used her political courage and her political understanding to open that up, to make room for widows to be on the stage, to make room for our voices to be in a struggle that had taken our people. And so that's who Anne was. And this whole stigma around communism really was all that this was about right then. It was a terrible, corrosive kind of thing. But back to what we were saying before about people, if you tell the truth and do the work, that people will listen and not be fooled. Anne was like that. She had that gift of talking to people, and people are like that. And when people in my community were approached to not work with me because I was a communist, there was this one woman I was doing police brutality work with at the time, Mrs. Farrell, and she said, "I don't care what you call her, she's doing God's work." I'll stop.
Oh, that was great. Thank you so much for sharing that, all of it. But yeah, you got to something that we were wanting to talk about next anyway, which is, let's talk about the rupture and continuity between social movements. You said that a split occurred after Greensboro. Can you and you just ended with talking about the malignment of people like yourself and Braden and communists in general, which then reinforced the effort to orchestrate a fictitious rupture between social movements. So let's talk about that. This book, okay, I'm not religious, does the God's work in terms of making the connection, you know, for people.
Oh,
like
you're in
myself.
trouble.
I mean, I'm Jewish or an atheist or something. I don't know. But you know, it does that work, right? Of connecting. For me, it's ancestor worship. No, forget about the worship part. You know, connecting with the ancestors. You know, she was around. The NAKN was around when I was a kid, growing up in Wisconsin, and I went to a KKK rally and with people in hoods protected by the police with like tons of space between themselves and the police. And I lost it and like, you know, was trembling and screaming my head off for like 3 hours nonstop. My brother comes up to me and he's like, you know, cool down. He was usually the hothead. She was behind the organization that organized that rally. And only as a 45-year-old am I getting a chance to really go in deep and read her words. So, and that is one of the themes I think of this. That's going to be one of the themes of this conversation is when we're feeling really unmoored, you know, just going back in a way that isn't nostalgic, you know, and that moves forward. Going back in a way that moves forward. It's not enough to do what Anne Braden did. We have to do more, right? So, you know, so Ben, can you tell us a little bit about, you know, what it was that I was just referring to in terms of the kind of fictitious rupture between social movements?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to remember the period when Anne Braden entered into movement work. You know, so she was born in 1924, got a job as a newspaper reporter in Louisville, Kentucky, in the late 40s, and you know, really early on, after that moment, joined into the CIO movement in the city, which was led by the farm equipment workers, a very powerful left-led movement. And then, you know, from there got involved in the Civil Rights Congress, which was led by William Patterson, who was a Communist Party leader, and, you know, many other movements. And there was really this very vibrant in the South and across the country left movement in that post-war period. But it was viciously and violently attacked, you know, from really 1946, 47 onward. And, you know, she talked about this a lot, the impact that had, not just on the individuals that, you know, had been attacked, but on the movement as a whole was really serious. So, you know, you had individuals like William Patterson and Claudia Jones and Paul Robeson, who were deported, had their lives nearly ruined. And then, you know, just as importantly, you had organizations like the Southern Negro Youth Congress, the Civil Rights Congress. And so those organizations, those folks are pushed out of the picture as much as the power structure can. And then you have this unstoppable Black movement rise, you know, beginning in, you know, with the first big rupture in 1955 with the Montgomery bus boycott, which I think, as a side note, happened the same year as Bandung, this conference of, you know, third world nations. And the left movement of those years, of the 30s and 40s, that Braden had really emerged from, was cut off from the movement that became the movement of the 50s and the 60s. And it wasn't totally cut off. You know, Braden and people like Jack O'Dell and people like Esther Cooper Jackson were these kind of people who like slipped through the cracks. And they were important. They played really important roles. But, you know, what she talked about was just that that false separation and that lack of continuity between movements, and the harm that it really did to the movement. And it put, you know, folks like the young SNCC activists in the 60s at a real disadvantage, and robbed them of the ability to fully kind of imbibe the lessons and the framework and the analysis of the movements that she really came out of. And it harmed the entire movement. She said, you know, those who are in power built a fence around the civil rights movement. And always there were people who were struggling to get out of that fence. Always the motion of it was asking bigger questions, but there was this real struggle to build that fence around it.
So could I add two things to that answer? One, what's great about the book is that you include her account of anti-communism, which she has a very broad account. She says you have to go back to the Dyes Committee in the 1930s, in that you can't separate it from COINTELPRO. So what she says that there's a continuous war in the name of anti-communism, in the name of so-called anti-terrorism, against these movements. And then the other thing, I just want to say that she makes a really clear argument about about the way in which an economic critique, an economic analysis was disrupted by this Cold War repression. And at the same time, she does imply, I just say imply, she states that it continues to exist despite that repression. So she talked about the March on Washington, right? As, having fundamentally an economic agenda. She talks about, and if you take someone like Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, one of the things that some of the people, the viewers may not know, is that his best friend was Eugene Dennis Jr., the son of the Communist Party leader. He grew up with, a kind of Marxist critique already. So it's not as if it's a complete rupture. There's a way in which it continues, and Anne Braden herself refuses that rupture because she's training people, she's building movements through SCEF, right? So I think it's there, but the fact that you have to have this constant repression is evidence of how dangerous it is. And that's the thing. It's like this constant struggle. And just one last thing about the Klan, because I think it's also worth mentioning, again, Roz knows this, but some of the younger viewers may not know this, just how pervasive, not just the Klan was and the Nazis, the fact that, you have Greensboro, but you have the Klan, basically attacking like over 100 towns, burning churches, from 1978 to 79, it's like a reign of terror. China Grove, places like that. So you have the Klan and Nazis on the rise, but the most important thing for me, and this is why when Anne says it's not just those individuals, it's the state. What happens to those people who murdered 5 activists, 4 of whom were members of the Communist Workers' Party? I mean, what happened to them? I mean, ultimately, the courts decided to basically acquit everybody. There was like 2 trials, and it was only a civil trial that led to some kind of civil suit that ended in 1985. But not just that, you have Fort Smith in Arkansas, 13 members of the White Power movement acquitted. Why? Because they convinced the jury that these white supremacists were trying to defend white women from Black rapists. I mean, it works. And that's when she says, if we're going to have fascism in this country, it's going to be around racism. That is the Achilles heel. She says it over and over again, right? So I just think that this is really, really important to remember, because this is where we are right now. Again, and it's not that I think people forget. I just think it's so ingrained that this is the origins of this country. You started out as fascism before there was fascism in Germany. And this continues to this day. And the question that Anne keeps challenging us to think, so how are we going to basically win this? We can't win it as long as racism exists. We've got to basically build. And it's not that white people are impenetrable, but it's hard work. And we've got to do that work.
Roz, do you want to jump in with anything?
No.
All right. I have a question anyway that I'm sure you'll have a lot of answers to, or ideas about. Let's talk. I mean, Robin led us there anyway. Let's talk about the way we organize today, and how Braden might say we could be organizing ourselves. In particular, we're going to start with this question. Okay, it's a dicey question. In terms of the place of white organizers in the struggle. Right now, it's a little bit more complicated. Maybe it was very difficult in her time, but it's a little bit more complicated now. So, what is the place of white organizers in the struggle against white supremacy and the struggle for collective liberation is kind of the question. But I'm gonna add a little context to the question that I have. As I was reading Anne Braden Speaks, I had some moments where I reacted against something she was saying, but then I kept reading, all right? And I want to ask, what was different about Braden's insistence that white people's consciousness could be changed through collective struggle? Now, specifically when I say let's bring in some context, what I mean is let's put into this a bit of the obvious context that I'm sure is on a lot of people's minds all the time these days. After the election of Trump, we saw a lot of liberal hand-wringing, people saying to themselves and others, why did this happen and how? And there were a lot of things wrong with the standard approach most of the media took to asking why he was elected, of course. And it took quite some time for certain types of liberal voters to realize that his election was not something that he fell from the sky. And if the media had asked someone like Braden, she would have told him right away that it was not at all difficult to contextualize the election of this narcissist wrangling the crowd with a white supremacist group, right? So, but when many white liberals started doing the work of trying to understand the historical and present-day context surrounding his rise to dominate the executive branch, they made a lot of incredibly erroneous assumptions about where they should start their search for an explanation. And first, they started wringing their hands trying to empathize with the poor whites that were supposedly to blame for Trump's election, which of course we know now after some research was not the case. The blame fell on middle-class whites, right? So empathy for their destitution was due. Attention to poor whites after ignoring them so long was due. But this wasn't really related to Trump. It was the result of the crisis of capitalism. So it's almost like this got displaced. The conversation around capitalism, which in anti-capitalism, which started after and during Occupy Wall Street, kind of got displaced. So I'm just wondering, there's the middle class whites who elected Trump. The current system of capitalism was working just fine for them. And in talking about poor whites and blaming them for the election of Trump, interestingly, we somehow avoided questioning the capitalist system. When I say we, I mean, I really don't mean us. I mean the mainstream media. I guess that's what I want to ask you all to kind of help us all parse through. It's complicated for white people. I don't know if it's complicated for people of color and BIPOC individuals, but it's what are some of the responses you have to what I laid out? Whether you disagree with some of what I said or are on the same page.
Let me maybe, I think an interesting place to start. Robin brought up Kwame Ture, and there's an interesting piece in, Black Power, the book that he wrote with Charles Hamilton. And a lot of people talk about that book. I think it doesn't get read as much. But in that book, Black Power, which is written in this moment of, the emergence of the Black Power movement in the mid-1960s, they said the only acceptable coalition that the Black Power movement will enter into in the South is with poor whites. And, Kwame Ture was a good friend of Anne Braden's. And a lot of that kind of analysis, I think, came out of conversations with her and other folks in the movement. And that's very interesting. And I think it kind of goes against the grain of the way that, a lot of folks think about multiracial organizing. So that's just one point. I think another point is that there was this movement in the 1960s of a lot of white organizers to go into white communities to do white organizing, which Anne Braden was a huge part of, and that was really, really important. One point that she always made was this cannot be done absent of coalition with the Black struggle. It has to be multiracial foundation. And a lot of folks weren't doing that, and I think don't do that. And so how do you build movements on a multiracial foundation? I think it's incredibly important. And she always identified poor whites, working class whites as the fundamental group who do not benefit from white supremacy. Go look at the white poverty rates in the Black Belt today. White folks that are working at Waffle House, that are unemployed, they're not benefiting from the system of white supremacy that exists. And I think that kind of coalition is the thing that could radically disrupt this society, especially
Roz is doing that work right now. Roz and Reverend Barber. I mean, literally doing that work right now. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, Reverend Barber, Liz or Harris, and of course you, Roz, at the forefront of this. You're doing that work exactly with poor white people.
So, we believe this is the only way to do this work. It's the only way to win, for all of us to win, that we have to build the kind of movement that crosses lines And it's with poor white folks and other people of color and others who can be drawn to coming together in one voice and in one demand. And for some people, this doesn't make sense, especially now in a period where people are talking identity politics more and other things. But what we've seen in this country is that this works, that people have neglected poor white folks because it's not easy. And we believe, and it's true, and lots of folks believe this who are trying to organize, that white people are suffering because of racism, and they can see it if you take time, and they can see it if you don't take the time, because white people are people and they are understanding their own conditions, and people will rise to the occasion. People will stand up. And the biggest example in our work has been our work in West Virginia, dealing with Manchin. So we have a vibrant Poor People's Campaign coordinating committee and work in West Virginia. And it's because our organizers working with folks who are organizing themselves in many different ways that we don't all think about as organizing. People are organizing, we get together with them, we're talking about the possibilities. And people see those possibilities, and then they do the work. And so while there are people who in West Virginia who Manchin says you don't deserve in West Virginia $15, you can live off 11, is what he told people. And people are basically saying that makes no sense to me. And then there's some other folks who are all being connected together who are saying, yeah, well, I tried this and this is the way we organize, and what are you doing? And we're seeing in West Virginia folks coming together and sitting in and writing together and raising money together and educating their children together. So this understanding of the need to build a fusion movement, a movement that's across all lines, it's clear. It's a clear thing, and it bears itself out in our day-to-day work. And it's through this collective activity that people can move forward. And that was clear to me when I was working in a factory, is that people who on the outside who never come together, but when they come together in struggle and understand more and more from each other about what's happening, people stay together, they change things. And it's in this method, in this model, that we can have a significant change in the country. Now it may take more than the Poor People's Campaign, but the Poor People's Campaign is in there in 37 states doing this model, really trying to bring people together, with a clear understanding of the world. We understand capitalism in the Poor People's Campaign, and we talk to people about that is systemic racism, it's systemic poverty, and who benefits from that are the rich folks who control us all, who control our communities. And so, campaigns like this are not difficult, but you have to be committed to it. And you have to be willing to and it's a long haul. It's not easy. It's not easy pickings. And a lot of times we as organizers, me included, want to take the easy route to organize it. We can't win that way. And until we realize that, and until we have some faith in our brothers and sisters who are white and our brothers and sisters who come from different backgrounds, we won't win. And that's the work I do every single day. And that's what I get up thinking about. And we've all got to do that. And people in this call, in this four squares, understand that. And people who are listening understand that. So we've got our work cut out. But my guess is that we would not be in this position now if we had taken a little time 10 years ago to tell people about what was happening in our economic system, why they were being shortchanged. If we had taken the time to even speak to them, And so when you have a vacuum, the vacuum gets filled. And in this case, filled by the right wing with nonsense.
That earlier, one of the video clips showed a page of the Southern Patriot, which Braden had edited, in which she's saying, there's all these people in the South, who's going to organize them? If it's not us, we know who will organize them. And it's not that that's what happened, because if that's what happened, we'd be in an even worse situation. People worked really hard to organize some of those people, and successfully did organize some of those people. It would be worse if we hadn't done any of that work. But obviously, a lot more of it needed to be done. So I don't know, if Robin, you wanted to jump in with something. You look like you did.
Well, no, I just wanted to both confirm and uphold everything that Roz just said, because I'm a historian, so I think about history. Yeah. If you look historically, why does Jim Crow and disfranchisement in the South and lynching take place after 1890? Why not after 1877? Because fusion politics. It was at the end of Reconstruction that you have these labor-based, multiracial organizations in the South, the Greenback Labor Party, the Populist Movement, the Readjusters. They were a threat. And the way to eliminate that threat was through taking the vote away from Black people.
That's right.
White supremacy and straight up violence. Mm-hmm. You could say the same thing about the New Deal period, where you have this emergent labor CIO organization, and then the Red Scare, in some ways was crushing it. But then let's take the 1970s, the period of Greensboro. I mean, think about what preceded that. The biggest strike wave in U.S. history in the 1970s. That's what came right before that. And the thing is, and this is why I hate liberalism, because liberals ultimately, are responsible in some ways for supporting a judicial and legislative approach that allows white supremacy to flourish. Mm. And so what you end up getting is all these white supremacist organizations that get to exist, that get supported, that don't get indicted or convicted for murder, and they end up getting a platform. And as you said, Rebecca, they get the cordon of police protection, right? So what ends up happening is that you have the kind of reaction. It's not just a backlash, but it's a reaction fueled by the state, the very, very liberal state. Because don't forget, it was Jimmy Carter that signed the Hyde Amendment, by the way. But still, you have this sort of I wouldn't even call it a right-wing reaction. It's a capitalist reaction.
That's right. To
multiracial working class organizing, and that's sort of where we are today. In that, who showed up at the Capitol on January 6th? It wasn't the white working class.
No,
those are middle class white people, professional right wingers, entrepreneurs, and the police state itself. They showed up, right? And meanwhile, all these poor working class white people are struggling.
That's right.
And they're being told that the reason they're poor is, once again, because these Negroes out there fighting for George Floyd are threatening your lives, right? And so we're back at this thing. That's why, as Roz was saying, it's really hard work that must be sustained. But it's not impossible. It's just not. We've proven that it happens, but every time it happens, we get the reaction. And that's why, as long as we believe in a kind of liberal, if we think that if we could just elect Biden, elect the liberal in office, and that's going to give us the breathing space we need to basically fulfill the creed that is America, that's just bullshit. It's just not true. It's just not.
Ben, do you want to jump in with anything here?
Yeah, the one thing that I'd add, and Roz taught me this, for those of us, especially for white folks, but for people who are trying to build a multiracial movement that's along class lines, you can't go around race. You have to go through it.
You have to go through it.
Braden talked about the centrality of race. And so, we can't, to use Robin's example, we have to get poor white folks to come to the George Floyd protests. And that's possible, but it's hard work. But I think developing that understanding and developing it only really develops through struggle. That's how people learn. And so I think, where do you build those common struggles? And Braden came out of the labor movement. That's kind of where she began that. They built the Southern Mountain Project and the grassroots organizing project in Mississippi, specifically to organize, in the case of the Mountain Project, poor white people to come to the Poor People's Campaign demonstration in 1968, Resurrection City.
That's right.
And so, this point of not avoiding issues of race, but building a multiracial movement on the basis of overcoming and overthrowing white supremacy.
Does anyone else want to jump in? No, not at the moment. Okay. So I'm going to play another clip. Actually, this will be our last clip. As you've all been saying, this is not new in this country, as Anne Braden was very clear about, and it was something that was not said very often in the 80s amongst. It wasn't reaching outside of radical spaces, really. This idea that white supremacy is at the foundations of this country. I think, I mean, Robin, you know better than I do, but I think that the tendency was to kind of like call to the promise of the American Revolution and kind of fulfilling that promise without acknowledging that the American Revolution had fundamentally early on been taken over and had white supremacist foundations. So, white supremacy and its fundamentalist, its fundamentally fascist dimensions are a feature of this nation. So I guess the question we want to end with is, how do we not allow the fact that we've been through this before to paralyze us? And to start this conversation, we're going to watch this clip of Braden remembering what William Patterson, the former Communist Party USA leader who recruited Braden into the Civil Rights Congress, and talk to her about joining the Other America, what he had to say to her and how it impacted her. So it's a pretty short clip we're about to see.
He said, you do have a choice. You don't have to be a part of the world of the lynchers. You can join the Other America. The people who struggled against slavery, the people who rebelled against slavery, the white people who supported them, the people who all through Reconstruction struggled. He came on down through history of the people who have struggled against injustice, the Other America. And sometimes people will say just what you need to hear at that point. I was very young. And that's what I needed to hear. And that's what I felt like I joined.
So, Ben, can you tell us a little bit about the Other America and what Anne Braden meant by that, and how the Other America is, still a space of potential for us today?
Yeah. Well, she had this phrase, a chain of struggle, and really identified this like tradition in U.S. history of resistance and rebellion, and a tradition that was actually very internal to the development of the United States, which I think is a really difficult thing for people on the left to sometimes come to terms with. Dr. King called the U.S. government the greatest purveyor of evil in the world. And, I think it's specifically in the U.S. context, when you're trying to build a revolutionary movement, how do you identify strands within the development of this country? It can be very difficult. But what she said was, there's a tradition, and it's not a tradition that's outside of the development of the country. It's actually internal to it. It started with, the resistance to genocide and to slavery, continued on through abolitionism, through the Reconstruction, populist movements. And she was a part of it, and we're all a part of it. And so identifying that tradition of the Other America, I think, to me, like, that's what gives me hope, is there is this tradition. And at the same time that a lot of really scary, disheartening stuff is happening all across the country, you see these explosive movements for change that really represent that tradition of the Other America right now. And to me, I think that is how we don't lose hope and don't lose sight of the possibilities of this moment.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, Robin has endless things to say about this in particular. It's such a complicated idea, right? I mean,
so you're saying I talk too much? Okay.
No,
I get it.
I can. Robin, everybody who's listening, Robin very much clearly started out behind the scenes saying, "I'm here to listen, especially to Roz." Since Roz has been are doing this work longer than any of us, and still amazingly doing this work.
Right.
So, Robin's been listening a lot. I think we all want to hear from Robin about this question.
Well, no, it's a really important question. I'll just be brief, because I think there's just a couple things to say. One, I when we look at our history, we've never been paralyzed by the fact that we live in a fascist country. I mean, in fact, if anything has been paralyzing, and I go back to my theme, it's liberalism. And that is to say, this idea that our history is one of continual progress, and that we're just always, this idea like the arc of the universe bends toward justice. That's just simply not true. We bend it, but it doesn't automatically bend. But we're supposed to believe that continual progress is what's expected, and that it just takes time. So whether it's Dr. King or Anne Braden or anyone says, look, we want freedom now, that's simply rejecting the notion that time will heal our wounds, or time will fix things, or we're just moving toward realizing the founding fathers' creed. But the founding fathers were about property, capital, ownership, oppression, patriarchy, violence. I mean, that's what this country is built on. So to me, liberalism is actually the problem. We have experienced the most intense repression under liberal regimes. Liberalism didn't give us anything. In fact, liberalism gives us things like more policing in the name of anti-poverty. It gives us civil rights legislation that really is about delivering votes to Democrats. It gives us liberal notions of abolition. Like right now in New York City, there's a proposal to create a feminist jail. Now, the fact that you have feminists in jail in the same sentence, really? But that's what liberalism has brought us. So what we need is radicalism, the radicalism of Anne Braden, the radicalism of Roz Pelles, the radicalism of all these movements that basically says that we need a fundamental shift. Capitalism is not the answer, right? We need to talk and act and struggle around transforming society, and not. So to me, it's that belief that if we simply wait and find the right Democrat, that we will be free eventually. That is what's paralyzing us.
That's right.
Yeah, Roz, do you want to say anything? I have something to jump in to say, but I don't want to say it before.
So for right now, I'll just, in my best Southern voice, say amen. But go ahead.
Oh, no. I guess it's just a question of what is America? You have to start with, when you talk about the other America, you got to say, what is America? Where does it start? Does it start in 1776? Do we have the founders narrative? Does it start when the people who drove out all the revolutionaries from the revolution signed their names to paper and drove them out of the room? Drove them, basically took the open space of the streets where people were having assemblies and said, no, we're going to put this inside a fixed space with 4 walls, and we're basically self-appointed representatives, and then we're going to decide what America is here and now, right? Mm-hmm. So if you talk about that version of America, which is what we're all raised with, like it or not, you can, then probably when you talk about the other America, then we're in a process of reckoning, thank God, finally, with that version of America. And now it's a question of, and this is what Robin D.G. Kelley's book does, is like thinking about, freedom dreams in particular. What is it we actually want to be? What, and that includes looking back at who we were, not in a way that rectifies history or erases anything. It's exactly like staring right in the face, as you said, Ben, not avoiding, but looking right through race, addressing it directly, and then we can become who we want to be, right? But yeah, I mean, to the question like that I was asking, how can we not just get incredibly depressed that Anne Braden was saying those things in the 80s, and people are just starting to say those things on a larger scale now. And when I say people, I mean white liberals are starting to grasp that this country was rooted in white supremacist foundations. How do we not get depressed about that? I think in bringing up this clip of the other America, when she's talking about the other America and having this little conversation we're having about it, I think what we talked about earlier, Ben, was also that we're talking about remembering traditions of resistance, that through line of traditions of resistance, and choosing to side with those people, right? And so I don't know if you have more that you want to say about that, Ben, if you've been thinking about that, or if Roz, you have anything to say you want to add in relation to that. Or you can also take a moment to think about it. This is the most difficult question for all of us always, right?
The only thing I would add is that there is, we've talked about this a little bit, but there is another America. There is a mass base for radical change, for revolutionary transformation in this country. And that is the basis upon which we need to build our movements. And it has to be built going through race, going through white supremacy, and defeating white supremacy first and foremost, and uniting working class poor whites into a multiracial movement that is incredibly vibrant right now, despite everything that's happening. I mean, you know, I think she talked a lot about the way that the Black freedom movement of the 1950s and 60s opened the door for the movements of the 60s, for the anti-war movement, for the feminist movement, for the labor movements that emerged. And, you know, I think in, you know, a different context today, you know, we really see the explosion of protest, you know, in the beginning of the pandemic around the murder of George Floyd has opened this door. And so you see, you know, young white workers all over the place forming unions. You see all these movements emerging. And I don't think you could have imagined that without the Floyd protests kind of kicking things off. And that's the moment we're in. And we have to push, and we have to identify what is the tradition that we're trying to speak in, to speak to as many people as possible who are hurting.
Yeah.
Talk though.
I want to ask specifically, maybe just as like to jog people's thoughts about this. You know, some things that have come up in the past when I talked to specifically Roz and Ben a little while ago was, you know, the role of political education. That's a big question. The role of the South, the Black working class tradition. You know, and thinking as we think about what it would mean to, you know, what the possibilities are that remain to us in terms of the transformation of our society and these different huge elements that I just kind of listed off so quickly. Does anything come to mind that you want to address people with in relation to any of those? Again, the role of political education, the role of the South, the role of the Black working class.
Well, can I say something real quick? This actually goes back to the other America question, though it's kind of tied to the question of political education. And let me just say one thing. So reading the text, and I really encourage everyone to buy this book and buy it from Monthly Review. Don't buy it through Amazon. Thank you. But one of the things that's clear is that Anne Braden herself is developing over time. And her ideas change subtly. The very final speech that she gives, I guess this would have been the year she passed, 2006, right? The Other America one, which we're talking about. She throws in there she mentions indigenous oppression, and she talks about it also in her 500 years of US foreign policy. And she comes to this realization about the importance of indigenous struggle and decolonization. And the reason I mention that is because in her early iterations, she talks about America as a wilderness. And we know it's not a wilderness. America was not a wilderness. America was a place of not modern nations as we know it, but actual communities of people who cultivated land, who had forms of law and social relations. And one of the things I think we have to do is critique that early absence and embrace the later presence of decolonization as part of it. So if we're going to develop a real true political education, it's one that imagines a decolonized America. That is the end of America as we know it. America has to come to an end and restore back, return the land. Because imagine what it means. We talk about all the struggles that laid the foundations for the next, but Standing Rock laid the foundations for where we are. This indigenous struggles and Black struggles in solidarity have also said we're in a climate catastrophe, which I know Anne Braden would completely recognize, that climate catastrophe is tied to the machinations of capitalism, tied to the dispossession of native peoples, tied to the ongoing dispossession and colonization that we're facing with. So I think that, any struggle to create the beloved community is one that has to come to terms with the history of dispossession of indigenous peoples and restore our relationships, not just to each other as human beings, but to life itself, to all of life, all of living creatures, past, present, and future. And to me, that's the work that's required, as we move forward.
Ben, I see you thinking. I don't know if sometimes when you're in the space of thought, the words don't come out of you, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to.
I'm just trying to read Roz's mind.
Well, Roz has shared a lot of really great things.
Well, but she has to, but I'm really waiting to hear what Roz has to say, because
so
wisdom.
So I'm really appreciating what you said, Robin, and thinking about how Anne and all of us continue to grow. We continue as we are open, and as the political climate changes, we grow with it or we don't. And Anne chose to keep moving forward and to grow with it, and I keep trying to do that. And people on this today are doing the same thing. And it brings up the role of education. In our movements, it's like not only are we at a place where we have to just organize around the concrete conditions, but we also have responsibility to do the education so that folks can move ahead, so that folks can we can all broaden our understanding of what's happening around us, and so that we can learn from each other. And so this role of education and struggle, I think, is critical. It's been critical in the work that we do in the Poor People's Campaign, where we talk about systems and where we talk about the importance of, where we look back at Reconstruction 1 and 2 and call for a third Reconstruction and talk about what that means. And I think that one of the things that we really have to do is to incorporate this kind of education that will move us ahead quicker and will help us build this beloved community. So that's my immediate thought on it.
And what's interesting is the way that I think it's such a good point about the way that she changes, and specifically around the indigenous struggle that Robin pointed out. She was such a listener, and I think such a learner. And those earlier kind of writings, I think there was, it's a very old left, I think, way of talking about the country.
That's true.
And she changed, but and then the 500 years of racism in U.S. foreign policy. I mean, it's one of my favorite pieces in the book, because she had such a deep analysis that I think is really not appreciated. People see her as an organizer, as a mentor, as this courageous figure, but that is one of the best analyses of U.S. foreign policy that I've ever read. And she's writing at a period when the Cold War is coming to an end, when the Soviet Union has been destroyed or defeated. And she says, and this is in the early 90s she's writing, the Cold War wasn't only about the US versus the USSR. Really, it was deeper than that. It was really global North versus global South. And the importance of making that kind of internationalist analysis, I think, is so critical. And it was really directly tied to the question of indigenous struggle in the US.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important for us to study people's evolution, to understand that this is a constant process for all of us. We're not fully formed at 17. Once we get out of high school, we don't have all the exact correct language to use and the full analysis. You could say, I think we were talking about this, Ben, you were saying she just kind of gets written off, sometimes just because she's, she was raised to be a Southern belle. And so you hear that and you just go X on that person. right? Okay, but what Roz said when we were talking behind the scenes was she was a person who would watch a news headline and she would be there. You know, she would show up to wherever that place was, and it wasn't easy to find your way. There wasn't Google Maps. Just like there was nobody telling you exactly what time things started. You know, she would watch a news headline, get in her car, and she'd show up. And it wasn't because somebody told her to show up. It's because she was driven to show up. And she talked consistently about how this was about her own liberation in a way that was not centering white people at all. It was just with the full, deep sense that she was in bondage when she lived in a white supremacist reality, and she needed to break free. So, so yes, I mean, you guys, I know you guys are going to continue this conversation with each other, and I think that it's incumbent on us in whether we're reading about Anne Braden, reading her words, or talking about her, to go and actually do something with this, right? It's incumbent.
Well, before you go, can we just end on some of her words? Could I just read something?
Oh, great.
I think is a really important passage. It's page 242, where she writes, "But if enough white people become convinced that it is Black people who are causing their problems, a proposition that powerful forces in this country are trying to convince them of right now, they have a frightening enemy that is right here at home. And under that circumstance, they could buy a police state. That is your potential mass base for fascism in this country." If there's ever a warning, it's that. You know, it doesn't take that much. And, you know, we keep getting pushback whenever you use the F word, fascism. Like, oh, no, that's not possible here. But we're seeing it happen right now. And if it's not just Black people, sometimes it's women, you know, as the enemy. Sometimes it's immigrants as the enemy. And they keep producing these enemies, creating the police state that we have to dismantle. And we've got to the point now where everyone's afraid to say things like defund the police when the police are part of the problem. You know, so I'm just saying to everyone on this call, go buy that book, read it, buy Kate Foster's book, read it, you know, read and don't believe the hype, right? Whether it's coming from folks who are believing in conspiracy theories or folks who believe that there's no possible way anything can change until the earth is destroyed. We can do better than that because we don't really have the luxury to sit back and decide, you know, maybe something might happen. We don't have the luxury to be optimistic or pessimistic. We just have to be determined.
That's right.
And Roz knows that because she's the hero. She's the one who's the most determined.
Because she's the oldest of us all. No, this is, you got to buy that book and you got to study Anne's words. I mean, this book comes at a time when it needs to be published. The time is right for it. The words are right for it, for us to study and to grab hold of as we do our work. So I agree. Everybody should read this book. Everybody should know who Anne Braden is. And I just want to appreciate you, Ben, for having the foresight to give us this gift at this time in our movement. So I thank you for it.
Well, thanks for teaching me about Anne Braden. I appreciate it.
Well, I'm grateful to each of you for not only, I mean, whether you identify yourself as part of the other America or not, but you know, for being a part of another version of this place, for creating a different sense of home in this place, and reminding others that they can do the same. And you know, as Braden said to MLK, courage is contagious. So let's keep it moving. We have to remember that we have to have the courage not to fight to the death within the white supremacist America that's pressing down on us all, but we have to get clear on the courage to keep on living, grounded in the conviction that whether or not you believe in nation states or borders or not, it is possible to make a home here and thrive in the other America. So thank you all. This has been really, really generative and restorative, and really appreciate all of you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody.